I woke up telling myself, it's just another day, because birthdays never meant much to me. Still, I checked my phone and smiled when Isla texted, "Come over tonight. I have something special planned." I replied, "You didn't have to," and she wrote back, "I want to." That made my chest feel warm. When I reached her apartment, Nina opened the door and said, "Birthday boy." I laughed softly and said, "Please don't shout." Zara smiled and added, "Relax, we won't embarrass you." Miriam nodded and said, "Cake later." I thanked them, already feeling awkward. Isla hugged me and whispered, "Happy birthday." I said, "You remembered," and she laughed, "Of course I did." I wanted to believe that laugh. I always wanted to believe her. I had never felt chosen before I met her, and I didn't want that feeling to end. Nina asked, "So, how old are you now?" I shrugged and said, "Old enough to stop counting." Zara joked, "That bad, huh?" I smiled and replied, "I just don't like attention." Isla squeezed my hand but kept glancing at her phone. Miriam noticed and asked, "Everything okay?" Isla said, "Yeah, just work stuff." I nodded and told myself not to read into it. I always did that. I always told myself I was imagining things. Nina said, "Sit, we'll order food." I said, "Whatever you like is fine." Zara looked at me and said, "You always say that." I answered, "I don't want trouble." She laughed and replied, "You're too nice." I didn't know how to explain that being nice was how I survived. Isla checked her phone again. I asked quietly, "Is someone waiting for you?" She shook her head and said, "No, don't worry." I said, "Okay," even though something felt off. She leaned close and said, "Tonight is about you." I smiled and said, "That's new." She laughed, but her eyes drifted away. I noticed, and it hurt more than I wanted to admit. Nina clapped and said, "Let's make this fun." Zara added, "Birthdays should feel special." I agreed out loud, but inside I wondered if I was already asking for too much. I told myself, "Don't ruin this." I sat there smiling, waiting for the moment she promised, convincing myself I mattered, because today was my birthday. Isla's phone buzzed again. Nina raised an eyebrow and said, "Busy night?" Isla replied too fast, "It's nothing." I joked, I should be jealous, trying to sound light. Isla forced a smile and said, "Don't start." Zara glanced at Miriam, and Miriam pretended not to notice. I asked, "Are you sure you're okay?" Isla answered, "Can we talk later?" I said, "Later is fine, even though later always meant never." She kissed my cheek and said, "Trust me." I nodded, because trust was what I was best at giving. As everyone talked over each other, I sat quietly. I told myself, "You're safe here." I ignored the tight feeling in my chest. I believed the promise she made. I believed tonight would prove I mattered. I watched her turn away again, and I swallowed my doubt, telling myself love required patience, silence, and faith, even when my instincts whispered warnings I refused to hear, because hope felt safer than truth on my birthday night alone again. Nina laughed and said, "You know what's weird about birthdays?" I smiled and replied, "What now?" Zara leaned back and said, "My ex and Nina's ex have the same birthday." Miriam added, "That's actually creepy." I laughed too and said, "Small world, I guess." Nina clapped and said, "Right? Same date, same year." Zara laughed louder and said, "Maybe terrible people are born together." I joked, "That explains nothing about me." They laughed again, and I told myself to relax. Isla laughed too. She said, "Yeah, my ex has the same birthday." I looked at her and asked, "Really?" She nodded and said, "Yeah." Nina asked, "What are the odds?" Isla shrugged and said, "Pretty funny, right?" Then she laughed again and said my name. I felt my smile crack. I said, "What did you just say?" My chest tightened, and my ears rang. Isla waved her hand and said, "Relax, it was a joke." I forced a laugh and said, "I don't get it." Zara stopped laughing. Miriam looked down. Nina went quiet. I asked, "Why would my name be part of that?" Isla avoided my eyes and said, "I didn't mean it like that." I said, "Like what?" She said, "You're taking it too seriously." I swallowed and said, "Explain it to me." She laughed again, but it sounded wrong. She said, "It just slipped out." I replied, "Slipped out from where?" Nina cleared her throat and said, "Maybe we should change the topic." Isla said, "See? Everyone's overreacting." I felt heat in my face. I said, "Was I supposed to laugh?" Isla crossed her arms and said, "Why are you making this awkward?" I answered, "Because it feels awkward." Zara whispered, "This isn't funny anymore." I looked at Isla and said, "Are you saying I'm like your ex?" She said, "No, don't twist my words." I replied, "Then untwist them." She stayed quiet. The silence felt louder than the laughter before. Miriam finally said, "Isla, you hurt him." Isla sighed and said, "I said it was a joke." I nodded slowly and said, "Jokes are meant to be funny." My hands shook. I hid them under the table. I laughed once, short and dry, and said, "Okay, I get it." Isla looked relieved. Nina looked guilty. Zara wouldn't look at me. I told myself not to react. I told myself not to ruin the night. I said, "I'm fine," even though my voice shook. Isla said, "See, he's fine." I replied, "Don't speak for me." Nina said, "Do you want water?" I said, "No." Zara asked, "Should we stop?" I said, "Too late." Isla said, "You're being dramatic." I answered, "You called my name." She said, "It meant nothing." I asked, "Then why did it hurt?" She said, "You're sensitive." I said, "I trusted you." She said, "You still do." I said, "Not after tonight." She whispered, "Please." I shook my head and said, "Let it go." The room stayed quiet, waiting. No one laughed, and my heart sank deeper. I felt exposed and alone there. Inside, questions screamed. Why my name? Why now? Why laugh first? I felt small, like I was standing in someone else's story. I realized then that jokes don't make rooms silent. Truth does. I touched Isla's arm and said, "We need to talk." She sighed and replied, "Now?" I said, "Yes, now." Nina looked at us, and I added, "Please." Isla nodded and walked toward the hallway. My heart pounded as I followed her. I said, "What did you mean back there?" She crossed her arms and said, "I told you, it was nothing." I replied, "Don't lie to me." She looked away and whispered, "You're pushing." I said, "Because you're hiding." She exhaled and said, "You were a safe choice." I laughed once and asked, "Safe from what?" She said, "From pain." I asked, "From him?" She didn't answer. I said, "Say his name." She said, "Ryan." Hearing it felt like swallowing glass. I said, "So I was your recovery?" She said, "That's not fair." I replied, "Is it true?" She hesitated, then said, "At first." My chest dropped. I said, "At first?" She said, "I needed stability." I said, "You needed a distraction." She snapped, "You don't understand what he did to me." I answered, "I understand what you did to me." She said, "You helped me heal." I replied, "By bleeding quietly." She looked down. Silence filled the space between us. I asked, "Did you ever love me?" She opened her mouth, then closed it. I waited. I said, "Say it." She said nothing. That silence screamed louder than any confession. I felt something inside me collapse. I laughed softly and said, so that's my gift. She reached for me and said, don't walk away. I stepped back and said, you already did. She whispered, I didn't mean to hurt you. I replied, but you did. From the living room, I heard Nina say, everything okay? Isla said, yes. I said, no. I grabbed my jacket. Zara stood up and said, wait. I shook my head. Miriam said, I'm sorry. I said, so am I. Isla followed me to the door and said, it didn't mean nothing. I said, that's worse. She said, please, it's your birthday. I replied, not anymore. She said, can we talk later? I said, there is no later. Outside, the air felt heavy. I leaned against the wall and laughed until it broke into sobs. I said out loud, I wasn't chosen. I wiped my face and said, I was convenient. My phone buzzed. I ignored it. I walked away without cake, without candles, without a wish. Each step felt like leaving pieces of myself behind. I realized my birthday wasn't stolen. It was exposed. That night, I lost more than a relationship. I lost the version of me who believed silence meant love. I stood there longer, listening to my breath. I said, I let this happen. I argued with myself, you wanted peace. I answered, I wanted love. Memories replied without mercy. I remembered her late replies. I remembered cancelled plans. I remembered choosing silence instead of questions. I said, you saw the signs. I answered, you hoped they lied. I pressed my palms together and said, get up. My legs shook. I said, you're still here. A passing car slowed. Someone laughed somewhere. Life didn't pause for my pain. I whispered, this is the end. Then I corrected myself and said, this is the truth. I took one step, then another. Each step hurt, but each step was mine. I didn't know where I was going. I only knew I couldn't stay that man anymore. I promised myself change would hurt less than staying broken forever. I chose walking away over begging for love that never chose me. Again. Tonight. Finally. Alone. I sat on my bed and said out loud, happy birthday to me. The room didn't answer. I opened my phone and scrolled through old messages. I whispered, you sounded so sure. I clicked photos and said, you looked happy. Each memory argued with the truth I didn't want. I told myself, you weren't enough. Then I snapped back, that's not fair. I argued with my reflection and said, you ignored the signs. I answered, because I wanted peace. The silence felt heavier than her words ever did. My phone buzzed. I sighed and said, not now. Then I saw the name and answered, Samir. He said, why do you sound broken? I replied, because I am. He asked, what happened? I said, she never chose me. Samir paused and said, did you choose yourself? I stayed quiet. He continued, you gave everything and asked for nothing. I said, that's love. He replied, that's fear. I clenched my jaw and said, you don't know her. He answered, I know you. I said, I trusted her. He said, you trusted comfort. I snapped, that's harsh. He replied, truth usually is. I asked, so this is my fault? He said, you allowed it. The words stung more than hers. I said, I didn't want to lose her. Samir replied, you lost yourself instead. I leaned back and whispered, I feel empty. He said, empty is better than fake. I laughed bitterly and said, easy for you to say. He said, I've been there. I asked, did it hurt like this? He replied, worse. I asked, what did you do? He said, I stopped begging. I swallowed and said, I don't know how. Samir said, you start by doing nothing. I said, nothing. He replied, no calls. No explanations. I asked, what if she comes back? He answered, then you'll know if she wants you or needs you. I looked at my phone and said, she'll text. He said, let her. I asked, what if I miss her? He replied, you will. I said, that scares me. He answered, it should. I whispered, I feel weak. He said, you're tired. I asked, will this pass? He replied, only if you let it. I nodded even though he couldn't see me. I said, I won't chase. He said, good. Before hanging up, he said, dignity hurts once. Begging hurts forever. I replied, thank you. He said, sleep. The call ended, and the room felt quieter, but steadier. I put my phone down and said, I won't explain myself anymore. I repeated it until it felt real. I said, I won't beg. I breathed and added, I won't chase. My chest still hurt, but my spine felt straighter. I lay back and stared at the ceiling. I told myself, survive tonight. Then I said, tomorrow can wait. For the first time since leaving, I didn't reach for my phone. I chose silence. I chose dignity. I woke up and said, don't text her. I repeated it while brushing my teeth. I said it again while tying my shoes. My phone stayed quiet, and I let it. At work, I told myself, focus. I answered emails and said, this matters. During lunch, I stared at my phone and said, not today. Silence felt heavy, but it felt clean. At the gym, Hassan slapped my shoulder and said, you disappeared. I said, I needed space. He laughed and replied, from who? I said, from myself. He nodded and said, that makes sense. Later that night, my phone lit up. Isla texted, can we talk? I read it and said nothing. Another message came. I don't understand why you're ignoring me. I whispered, you do. I locked my phone. The next morning, she wrote, I miss you. I said out loud, missing isn't choosing. I went to work early and stayed busy. At night, she called. I watched it ring and said, no. Hassan asked, you okay? I said, I'm learning. He smiled and said, good. He handed me a coffee and added, come with me tomorrow. I asked, where? He said, anywhere new. Another message appeared. I'm confused. I read it slowly and replied in my head, so was I. She sent another. I never meant to hurt you. I said, intent doesn't erase damage. I kept quiet. At the gym, Hassan said, you look stronger. I said, I feel tired. He replied, that's growth. I laughed and said, you always say that. He answered, because it's true. That night, Isla sent a long message. I keep replaying everything. I don't know why I said what I said. I'm sorry. I read it once. I read it twice. I put the phone down. I told myself, silence isn't cruelty. I said, it's clarity. I slept without checking my phone. Days passed. Work, gym, sleep. Hassan introduced me to people and said, this is who you were. I said, I forgot him. He replied, you're meeting him again. Isla called again. I let it ring. She texted, please. I said, no, not out loud. Inside. Firm. Hassan asked, do you miss her? I answered, yes. He said, then you're human. I asked, why does silence feel powerful? He replied, because you're finally listening to yourself. That night, I looked at my phone and said, I choose me. The screen stayed dark. My chest felt lighter. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need answers. I had control again, and it came from saying nothing. Nina messaged me and said, "Can we talk?" I replied, "Sure." She called and said, "I didn't want to tell you this, but you should know." I said, "Just say it." She hesitated and said, "Isla went back to Ryan." I stayed quiet. Nina added, "It didn't last." I asked, "How long?" She said, "A few weeks." I replied, "Figures." Nina sighed and said, "He left her again." I said, "I'm not surprised." She continued, "Zara and Miriam are moving out." I asked, "Why?" She said, "They're tired." I nodded even though she couldn't see me. Nina said, "She's not doing well." I answered, "I hope she figures it out." Nina paused and said, "She regrets everything." I replied, "Regret comes late." Nina whispered, "I'm sorry." I said, "Thank you for telling me." The call ended. I sat there and said to myself, "This isn't happiness." I didn't smile. I didn't feel proud. I just felt clear. That evening, Isla showed up. She stood in front of me and said, "Please don't shut the door." I said, "Say what you came to say." She looked tired and said, "I messed up." I replied, "You knew that already." She said, "Ryan left." I answered, "Again." She nodded and said, "I thought he changed." I said, "You thought wrong." She stepped closer and said, "I lost you." I replied, "You gave me up." Her voice shook as she said, "I didn't know what I had." I answered, "I did." She said, "You loved me." I replied, "I respected you." She whispered, "I still love you." I said, "That's not enough anymore." She started crying and said, "I'm alone." I answered, "You chose that." She said, "Can you forgive me?" I stayed silent. She asked, "Please." I said, "Forgiveness doesn't mean return." She wiped her face and said, "I lost someone real." I replied, "Yes." She said, "You were different." I answered, "I still am." She asked, "Why can't we try again?" I said, "Because I finally chose myself." She said, "I was confused." I replied, "I was clear." She said, "I needed time." I answered, "I needed truth." She whispered, "I'm sorry." I said, "I believe you." She looked hopeful. I added, "But it's too late." She reached for my hand. I stepped back and said, "Don't." She asked, "Is this karma?" I replied, "It's consequence." She said, "I deserve this." I answered, "I'm not here to punish you." She nodded slowly and said, "You've changed." I replied, "I had to." She asked, "Will you ever miss me?" I said, "I already did." She said, "And now?" I answered, "Now I move on." She took a breath and said, "Goodbye." I said, "Take care." She turned away. I watched her leave without chasing. I didn't feel powerful. I felt peaceful. I said quietly, "Karma didn't need me." I closed the door and walked forward, lighter, knowing self-respect was the real ending I deserved. I walked into the cafe and said quietly, "Another coffee, black." The barista nodded. I watched the steam rise and told myself, I'm still me, just stronger. Months had passed, and I noticed the difference in my voice, in the way I held my shoulders. Hassan sat across from me and grinned. He said, "You look different." I replied, "Different how?" He leaned back and said, "Calmer. Sharper. You're not carrying ghosts anymore." I smiled lightly and said, "I'm just, awake." Hassan laughed and asked, "Awake? That's new." I said, "It's called surviving." He nodded, "I see it. You set boundaries now." I replied, "Finally." I thought about how I stopped shrinking for others. I said aloud, I don't bend to please anymore. Hassan said, good. You needed that. I added, it doesn't make me happy all the time, but it makes me mine. I sipped my coffee and remembered the silence I had chosen. I said, silence wasn't empty. It was my power. Hassan smiled, that's why you're not chasing anyone. I nodded and said, I realized chasing never fixed me. As I left the cafe, I saw Isla by the corner window. She looked tired, worn. I stopped for a moment and said to myself, nothing. No heat. No sadness. Just the calm I had earned. I watched her and added, that emptiness. It's victory. Hassan's words echoed in my head, you're not the same man you were. I said out loud, no, I'm better. I walked past her without hesitation. No guilt, no longing, just a steady step. I thought back to the nights I cried alone, to the messages I didn't answer. I said, each step rebuilt me. Hassan had once said, growth doesn't feel gentle. I whispered, it didn't. And it shouldn't have. A colleague waved at me, and I smiled naturally. I told myself, I see people. I don't need them to see me. Hassan called later, you've changed, man. I said, I know. I walked home and reflected, I'm not rich. I'm not famous. But I'm whole. I thought of my old self, quiet, fearful, hoping for scraps of love. I said, he's gone. I paused at the door and said, I survived her betrayal. I survived me. Hassan once asked, do you feel broken? I replied, no. Rebuilt. I looked in the mirror and said, the man I became isn't perfect, but he's mine. No apology. No tears. Just clarity. Just strength. I whispered, I finally choose me first. And I meant it. My phone buzzed. I saw Isla's name and said, here we go. I opened the message. She wrote, I don't know where to start. I've thought about you every day. I hurt you more than anyone should. I wish I could undo everything, but I can't. I'm sorry for being selfish, for choosing comfort over love. I lost someone who loved me truly, and I realize that now. I don't expect anything from you. I just needed you to know. I stared at the words. I whispered, she's finally honest. I read it again. She's finally real. My chest tightened, but not with anger. Just clarity. I said out loud, closure doesn't need talking. I sat back and let the quiet fill the room. My phone rested beside me. I didn't type a reply. I didn't delete her number. I just listened to my own heartbeat. She sent another, shorter one, I hope you're okay. I read it and said, I am. I always was, eventually. I picked up the small gift she had bought months ago for my birthday. I turned it over in my hands, the paper torn slightly. I whispered, this belonged to a different me. I opened it once, then shook my head. Not mine anymore. I threw it in the trash. Not with anger. Not with hatred. Just with acceptance. I said quietly, this is the end. For both of us. I looked around my apartment and said, silence can be louder than words. The quiet felt like a shield. Like finally being home. Another message came, I hope you forgive me someday. I said, I already have. I forgave myself first. I didn't open it again. I didn't need to. I leaned back and whispered, peace isn't forgetting. It's letting go. My chest felt lighter. My hands unclenched. My mind stopped replaying the past. I picked up my phone and deleted the conversation. Each tap felt final. I said, no more shadows. No more questions. I got up, walked to the window, and looked out. I said, I don't need her words anymore. I never did. The city lights blurred slightly. I felt calm. Real calm. I whispered to myself, the man I am now deserves this quiet. Deserves himself. The gift, the messages, the regrets, all gone from my space, but not from memory. I said, they exist only to remind me I survived. I took a deep breath. I smiled softly. I said, goodbye, Isla. And thank you. No reply. No echoes. Just silence. And peace. I sat back down, feeling the weight lift. I said, this is my closure. Not hers. Mine. And finally, it felt enough. I woke up and said, it's my birthday. No expectation, no dread. Just the date. I made coffee and whispered, 1 year later. Here we are. Hassan called and said, happy birthday, man. I laughed and replied, thanks. Coffee's already helping. He said, celebrating. I said, quietly. With people who matter. Later, my phone buzzed. I glanced at it, no messages from her. I smiled softly and said, exactly what I want. I met Hassan and a few friends at a small cafe. He said, look at you. Calm, steady. I see it. I replied, feels good. Feels, earned. One friend said, you seem different. I said, I am. We laughed over small things. I said, this is enough. This is enough for me. Hassan nodded and said, you finally chose yourself. I replied, it took a year of learning the hard way. Later, alone for a moment, I said, I remember last year. How I felt abandoned, betrayed, small. I laughed bitterly. I thought losing her broke me. Instead, it rebuilt me. I pulled out an old note I had kept, my own words from months ago, silence is power. I read it aloud and said, it's true. A friend asked, do you ever regret? I said, I regret letting it hurt me then. Now. No. Pain taught me who I am. I whispered, I don't shrink for anyone anymore. I don't settle for scraps of love. I said it again, louder, I deserve full choice, full respect, full love. Hassan raised his glass and said, to the man you've become. I smiled and clinked mine. To surviving. To learning. To me. Later, I sat quietly and said, this birthday is mine. Not stolen. Not borrowed. Fully mine. The thought felt heavy but light at the same time. I said, betrayal hurts, but staying broken is a choice. I choose not to. I whispered, I choose myself. I looked at the small candles on my quiet cake. I said, I'm worth it. I always was. I closed my eyes and let a soft smile spread. I said softly, the worst birthday gave me the greatest gift, self-worth. And now, no one can take it from me. I blew out the candles and said, here's to me, finally whole.